Hey, Zach here in Railroad, Pennsylvania. Today I'm going to be walking on a short section of the Heritage Rail Trail, which follows the path of the old Northern Central Railway that traveled between Baltimore, Maryland and Sunbury, Pennsylvania. As you can see, there's still rails here, and there's actually an excursion train that runs here that we'll probably see. I hope you'll come along with me. It should be a good one. In this video, we will explore the history of Railroad, Pennsylvania, walk on the scenic York County Heritage Rail Trail along the former Northern Central Railway tracks, and explore New Freedom, Pennsylvania. And we might just see a train along the way. York County is situated in southern Pennsylvania, just north of the Maryland border, and in southern York County sits the quaint town of Shrewsbury. Incorporated in 1834, it is one of the oldest boroughs to be chartered in the county. It was built with its main street along the old turnpike between York and Baltimore, and it was the first stop north of the Mason-Dixon line. In the modern age, Shrewsbury still sits near the major artery between York and Baltimore, but these days, that is in the form of Interstate 83. When the first railroad came through the area in the late 1830s, the builders chose to stick to the relatively flat path along the Codorus Creek, instead of the much hillier path that would have taken the tracks through Shrewsbury itself. Since the railroad missed the town entirely, it built a small depot at the point of closest approach, a mile west and down the hill from the Shrewsbury town center. This stop was established as Shrewsbury Station, but the railroad's presence helped it quickly evolve from just a rail depot to an industrial suburb. By 1858, when a railroad post office was established in the growing community, it was clear that a name change was underway, likely stemming from the citizens of Shrewsbury making the trip down the hill to the railroad. Whatever the reason, the name was officially changed to Railroad, Pennsylvania when the borough was incorporated in 1871. In the latter half of the 19th century, railroad boomed with industries. Among these were a flavine factory north of the station for processing tree materials into yellow dye used for antiseptics and tanning leather. Just east of the station sat the residence and business buildings of J.P. Everhart, who set up a successful freight forwarding business. Toward that end, he acquired a fleet of rail cars and even hosted a railroad siding across his property. Across the Codorus Creek, there was a leather tannery and rendering factory built by Frederick Helb. Helb would buy old worn-out horses and mules from local farms to harvest the hides from after they died. Stories tell of how his business boomed during the Civil War, when countless horses and mules fell victim to wartime accidents, usage, and battle. Here is a picture of part of the Helb tannery and homestead, taken around the turn of the 20th century. The only building that still exists is the one in the background, which was the residence of the tannery superintendent. In addition to the industries, Railroad also contained general stores and the Jackson House, built in 1859, which served as a hotel for many years before being converted into an apartment house. In more recent years, it has come full circle to become a bed and breakfast, which still operates today. As the 20th century wore on, most of these industries either shut down or left the area. The factory buildings sometimes found other tenants, but eventually sat vacant for years before finally being razed in the mid-1900s. Even the railroad largely disappeared, leaving the borough of Railroad without its namesake. But as we can see, there is still a significant residential footprint here today. The town, isolated as it is in this valley, presents the air of encapsulated history. Many of these buildings date back over 100 years to Railroad's heyday, and the train tracks are still actually here. Today, the legacy of Railroad, both the borough and the trains, lives on as the York County Heritage Trail passes right through the town along the old railroad right-of-way. This trail, running from York in the north to the Maryland state line, attracts thousands of bikers and hikers annually, making it one of the county's favorite parks. In the borough of Railroad, the trail parking lot is situated on the spot where the old train station and flavine plant once stood, and it is here that we'll begin our explorations today. Next to the parking lot, we immediately find some ruins left over from the old flavine factory that once stood here. These are likely the walls of the tree bark storage shed. And as we walk through the parking lot here, we are following the path of the old spur line that serviced J.P. Everhart's businesses. The spur line would have continued into the Everhart property here, towards some material storage sheds that once sat near Main Street. Here we can see a better view of the property, including the red barn in the distance, which dates back to Everhart's operations. Back on the trail, the railroad station would have sat on the left here, right where these colorful trees are now. Built in the 1850s, the two-story brick structure was a combination passenger and freight station that also contained the station master's living quarters on the second floor. In this image, circa the 1870s, you can see the Flavian factory behind the station, along with some rail cars parked on the spur. Accounts say that passenger and freight service at the station ceased in 1942, likely because of the businesses leaving the area and the proximity of other nearby stations to the north and south. The station sat here until 1954 when it was finally demolished. Before continuing on, I want to present this image looking south from the shadow of the station house in 1910. The buildings ahead are the aforementioned Jackson House Hotel on the left and a general store on the right. Compare that image to the present day as we approach Main Street. Both of those buildings still exist, serving pretty much their original purposes. From near the railroad crossing, we can get a panoramic view of the heart of the borough, starting with the old Everhart property, continuing to the historic residences lining Main Street, and down to the Jackson House. The old hotel building is well maintained as an operational bed and breakfast, while the old general store is now an antique store. That white building just behind the antique store used to be a bark storage shed for the tannery, but now serves as the railroad borough building. And finally, the old residence across the intersection is the tannery superintendent house that we saw in the old picture before. I doubt that this old horse hitching post is original, but it is a nice touch outside the antique store. I also like this quaint railroad crossing sign. From here we'll continue south on the rail trail, leaving the borough of Railroad behind. I feel like this trail is fairly unique in that the intact southbound track is still in place. The trail itself sits on the spot occupied by the northbound rails. Early maps showed a short siding between the tracks and the store here on the right. We can see that a lot of rock had to be removed through here to accommodate the tracks. Once leaving Railroad Borough, the trail is fairly isolated for a while, and you can get a sense of what it must have been like to ride the trains through this idyllic valley. It wasn't always so isolated, though. Ahead, on the right, was the location of the Ceiling Furniture Factory, which existed there from around 1900 until the 1970s, and was Railroad Borough's last big industry. It was serviced by the railroad with its own spur line. The factory itself was slowly raised in the 80s and 90s. And today, a brewery sits at the location. Here we can see the brewery from the other side, with what looks like old retaining walls along the Codorus Creek. Now, before we go any further, I should give at least a little background on the railroad tracks we're following. In the mid-1800s, a series of railroads were built to connect the growing port of Baltimore with farmers and producers in central PA, along the Susquehanna River. This endeavor started with the Baltimore and Susquehanna Railroad, which began construction north out of Baltimore in the early 1830s. The Pennsylvania General Assembly barred the railroad from operating in PA, as they didn't want to share profits with the neighboring state. The B&S got around this by funding other chartered railroads north of the Mason-Dixon line, which they later came to control financially anyway. The York and Maryland Line Railroad extended to York, Pennsylvania in the late 1830s. The York and Cumberland Railroad pushed north to Lemoyne, just across the river from the state capital of Harrisburg in 1850. And the Susquehanna Railroad was on its way to Sunbury, in the heart of the coal regions, when the B&S essentially ran out of money, declaring bankruptcy in 1853. This affected not just the B&S, but all the other lines that it controlled. In 1854, the 4 failing railroads were consolidated into one company, the Northern Central Railway, and as part of the deal, its outstanding debt was streamlined into a single, more manageable mortgage. Part of the consolidation agreement was that the NCR would extend the rail line north to Sunbury, as it had originally intended anyway. This was finally completed in 1858, creating an all-rail network from the coal regions in Sunbury to the ports of Baltimore. Initially, the NCR merger seemed to work, and business along the railroad boomed. However, this was a double-edged sword because the outdated rail infrastructure was in dire need of updating to handle the increased rail traffic and heavier coal trains prevalent on the line. Within a few years of its creation, the new railroad was already in financial trouble and unable to pay its debts. It was at this point, in the early 1860s, that the growing Pennsylvania Railroad bought up large chunks of NCR stock and gained financial control of the company, giving it a pathway to Baltimore to compete with its rival, the B&O. For the next 11 decades, the NCR operated as a subsidiary of the Pennsy. The NCR, as a north-south railroad that bridged the Mason-Dixon line, played a significant role during the American Civil War as a major transportation route for supplies and troops. President Lincoln twice took an NCR train, passing the same spot we are walking along today. First, on his way to Gettysburg to give his famous address in 1863, and finally on his funeral train in 1865, as it made its way from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. The line carried heavy freight and passenger traffic until the 1950s. By then, the Pennsy was routing most of its through freight trains on the more direct and flatter Port Road branch along the Susquehanna. The completion of Interstate 83 in 1959 quickened the decline of rail traffic on the NCR. Local freights and some through passenger trains continued to use the NCR tracks into the early 1970s. Then, in 1972, Hurricane Agnes came through the area and destroyed significant portions of the line, causing the Penn Central to abandon the rails between York, PA, and Cockeysville, Maryland. Today, the abandoned right-of-way largely exists as a series of rail trails in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Additionally, the Maryland Light Rail commuter line uses a rebuilt section of the right-of-way to connect Baltimore with Cockeysville. And in York County, for over a decade, an excursion train has been run north out of New Freedom on the same ex-NCR tracks that we are walking along now. The excursion train is run by the aptly named Northern Central Railway of York. And I think I hear it coming now. There are a couple of different engines they use. One is a replica Civil War steam engine, and another is an old Pennsy GP9 diesel. But the one they are using today is a GE 80-ton switcher that was used at the Letterkenny Army Depot in Chambersburg, PA until 2013. The Codorus Creek curves under the tracks here. Some of the bridges on this line have been designated historic landmarks, but this one looks fairly modern. Although some of the foundation looks like it could be original. As we approach Kirshner Road, you'll notice that there are no gates or even warning lights at the railroad crossing. When the excursion trains come through, a flagger drives ahead to warn approaching cars. But it does make me wonder how safe it was when the NCR was in full operation. But I guess those were simpler times. There wasn't much chance to see wildlife on this walk, but I did find something. This was one of a number of woolly bear caterpillars crossing the trail. We're getting closer to New Freedom now. Here's mile marker 38, counting the distance from the line's original terminus in Baltimore. The fall foliage is quite vibrant along the trail. At first I thought someone left their bike along the trail for a quick trip into the woods, but the bike is actually part of an interesting sculpture garden along the trail. I especially like this bird, which I'm going to go out on a limb and call a crow. I'm not sure if this mask is supposed to be part of the sculpture garden or not, but it sure did creep me out. From here on, the trail is paved, and ahead are the relics of some old signal lights. The position of this one is a little curious, as it seems like it would be sitting right in the middle of where the northbound track would be. I doubt it was moved considering the trail kinks around it. The rails here are pretty well maintained by the Excursion Railroad. The marker on the right is a reminder to the engineer to blow the whistle for an upcoming crossing, which is especially crucial on a line with no crossing gates or lights. As a clear indication that we are approaching civilization in the form of New Freedom, the rail line splits up ahead. And here's the crossing with Pleasant Avenue, which that whistle marker we saw before was warning about. There likely would have been 3 or even 4 tracks here as we make the final approach to New Freedom. One of the reasons there were so many tracks through here is that this is the highest point between Baltimore and York, and New Freedom would house many of the helper engines used to move heavy freights up the hills. By the mid-1900s, more powerful diesel engines rendered these helpers obsolete. As we approach the town, this is probably an opportune time to elaborate on the history of New Freedom. Starting with the name, which I always assumed was a reference to its position just north of the Mason-Dixon line. But I was wrong. The town is actually named after the members of the Free family, who were among the first to take up residence in the area. In honor of these early settlers, the residents tried to name the borough Freedom when it was incorporated in 1873. Since that name was already taken in Pennsylvania, New Freedom was chosen instead. The earliest residents to the area were attracted by the rich, fertile soil which allowed farming and other agricultural endeavors to thrive. When the railroad came through the area in 1838, it provided an outlet for growers to ship their crops to new markets. The railroad also fostered industrial growth over the years. These industries included the Summers Canning Factory, built to can and ship the fresh local harvests. This was a fixture on the south end of the town from the early 20th century until it merged with Hanover Foods and was moved out of the area in the mid-1980s. The site is now home to a business park. On the north end of town, for many years sat the American Insulator Company. Started in 1916 when it took over the site from an earlier wire cloth mill, it originally manufactured asbestos-based insulation for use in automobiles. In subsequent years, it would shift focus with the changing times, sometimes making molded plastic pieces for appliances and automobile parts, and later working with electrical and communications tech firms. After 70 years of operation, the company closed down in 1986. The factory grounds were later designated a Superfund site by the EPA. Many months were spent cleaning up the residual chemical contamination before the buildings were finally demolished in 1987. These days, a housing development has been built at the location. These are just a couple of the many industries that benefited from proximity to the railroad in New Freedom. In 1885, a short line railroad was constructed to the nearby town of Stewartstown, and the interchange between the Stewartstown Railroad and the NCR was located in northern New Freedom. That same year, the NCR built a combination passenger and freight station to handle the increased business that the new line would generate. Here we can see that station in 1912, with the platforms on the right side of the tracks built to serve the Stewartstown Railroad customers. Just as happened in Railroad Borough, increased automobile and truck usage, as well as the construction of Interstate 83, led to an overall decline in railroad traffic. The station in New Freedom was closed in the 1960s, and all passenger service ceased by 1970, 2 years before Hurricane Agnes closed the railroad for good. These days, there are still several longtime businesses operating in the town, but New Freedom largely exists now as a primarily residential community that houses an increasing number of commuters from nearby bigger cities. Back to our exploration, as we enter the town from the north, we can see the tracks from the Stewartstown Railroad coming in on the left. Here we can see the various tracks converging to the main line, which stretches off to the east. I will actually cover the Stewartstown Railroad more fully in an upcoming video. Continuing on, the old American Insulator Complex would have been just on the other side of the tracks ahead, behind where that engine is sitting. Here's the end of a siding that has been cut off from the main tracks. You can see how the covered-over tracks are leaving a pattern on the path from below. Following the pattern, we can see this siding come out from under the path on the right ahead, and there are actually a couple of landlocked cabooses parked on it further down. Parked on one of the Stewartstown Railroad tracks is this switcher engine, which was originally built for the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad in 1952. As you can tell from its paint job, it spent some time in the service of the Ma and Pa Railroad in York, Pennsylvania, before being acquired by the Stewartstown Railroad in 2018. Here is a handcar and a couple of Pennsylvania Railroad cabooses sitting at the end of this station siding. And just beyond them is the restored New Freedom Station, which now houses a gift shop and the ticket office for the Excursion Railroad. Across from the station are a couple of passenger cars owned by the Excursion Railroad, originating from the Union Pacific and Southern Pacific respectively. Just south of the station, I found these super cool train-themed benches. They look like the perfect place to take a rest, but I have to keep moving because there is more to see. Just beyond the parked passenger cars are these surviving signal towers, one a little more complete than the other. As we come to the Franklin Street crossing, most of the tracks have ended, although they would historically have continued on through the town. By the way, there is a really good ice cream shop down Franklin Street, occupying the old movie theater that we can see in the distance. It's closed for the season now, but definitely worth a stop if you are in the area during the warmer months. Between Franklin and Main Streets, I spied another mile marker across the tracks. As we come to the Main Street crossing, we can see another building occupied by the Excursion Railroad. On a previous visit, this building actually contained their gift shop, but it has since been moved to the station house. The building has one of those whistle markers on display out front, and a mural on the side showing some of their locomotive roster. The building itself seems to double as storage for the replica steam locomotive. And out back is a storage area where their GP9 is parked. Past this storage area, we are nearing the southern edge of New Freedom and the end of our journey today. But I do want to check out the old Summers canning site ahead on the left side of the tracks. Crossing High Street, this building on the left was part of the canning facility. There is even a commemorative mural for the long-lost industry on the side of the building. But what really caught my eye was the remnants of an old siding that used to serve the cannery, and the old train wheels piled on top. I decided to follow it and noticed these covered over doorways, which likely were used for the loading of boxcars. While the old section of rail ends pretty quickly, this paved path seems to be built onto the old spur right of way. Following the path all the way back, I was rewarded with a couple of locations where the old rails were still poking through. Back on the trail, the rails and the trail do continue on to the south to meet up with the Torrey C. Brown Trail in Maryland. But I will save that exploration for another day. On the way back through New Freedom, I caught the Excursion train returning to the station, which was a nice capper to the day. Well, I hope you liked this short walk along the Heritage Rail Trail from Railroad to New Freedom, Pennsylvania. I'll probably film more videos in other areas where the Northern Central Railway passed through, so you should probably subscribe if you want to see more of those. Let me know in the comments whether you like this video, and I'll see you next time.